Nationwide protests across the United States. Across the United States, large-scale protests have unfolded in multiple states and major cities, marking one of the most significant waves of domestic unrest in recent years. What initially emerged as localized demonstrations has expanded into a nationwide phenomenon, drawing attention from federal authorities, state governments, financial markets, and international observers. The protests are primarily linked to immigration enforcement actions carried out by federal agencies, but their scope goes beyond a single policy area. They reflect deeper tensions within the American political system, particularly regarding the balance of power between federal institutions and state authorities, the role of law enforcement, and public trust in governance. This report examines the causes behind the protests, their geographic spread, the institutional response, and the broader implications for the United States and the international system. To understand the current situation, it is necessary to place these events in context. Over recent years, immigration policy in the United States has become increasingly centralized, with expanded federal authority over enforcement operations. These measures have been justified by national security concerns and border control priorities, but they have also generated resistance from local governments and civil society groups. Tensions escalated following several high-profile enforcement operations that resulted in civilian casualties and arrests during protests. These incidents acted as a catalyst, transforming policy disagreements into mass mobilization. Demonstrations initially concentrated in a limited number of urban centers, but quickly spread across state lines, coordinated through social networks and advocacy organizations. By the end of the first week, protests had been reported in dozens of cities, including major economic and political hubs. While the majority of demonstrations remained peaceful, their scale alone elevated them into a national political issue. Geographically, the protests show a broad distribution, rather than a concentration in one region. States on both coasts, the Midwest, and parts of the South have experienced sustained demonstrations. This nationwide spread distinguishes the current movement from previous protest waves that were often regionally concentrated or issue-specific. Crowd sizes vary significantly by location, ranging from several hundred participants to tens of thousands in major metropolitan areas. Importantly, the protests are not limited to traditional activist communities. Labor groups, student organizations, faith-based networks, and local officials have appeared alongside long-established advocacy movements. This diversity has reinforced the perception that the unrest reflects systemic concerns rather than isolated grievances. The response from political institutions has been cautious and measured, reflecting the sensitivity of the issue. Federal authorities have emphasized the legality of enforcement operations and the need to maintain public order. At the same time, several state and municipal governments have publicly questioned the scope and methods of federal action within their jurisdictions. This divergence highlights a structural feature of the U.S. system: the ongoing negotiation between federal power and state autonomy. While the Constitution grants the federal government authority over immigration, enforcement often relies on cooperation with local agencies. The current protests have strained this relationship, exposing fault lines that extend beyond immigration into broader questions of governance. Congressional reactions have followed familiar lines, with calls for investigations, hearings, and legislative review. However, there is limited evidence so far of immediate policy change. Instead, the focus remains on managing the situation and preventing further escalation. From an economic perspective, the protests have not yet caused significant disruption to national output, but they have introduced short-term uncertainty. Financial markets have shown increased volatility during periods of heightened tension, particularly in sectors sensitive to political risk, such as infrastructure, transportation, and consumer services. International investors and partners are closely monitoring developments. The United States remains a central pillar of the global economic system, and perceptions of internal stability matter. While protests alone do not undermine economic fundamentals, prolonged unrest can affect confidence, especially if accompanied by policy paralysis or legal uncertainty. Beyond economics, the protests carry implications for U.S. foreign policy and global standing. American domestic stability has long been presented as a foundation of its international leadership. Images of nationwide demonstrations, debates over civil liberties, and visible friction between levels of government complicate this narrative. International media coverage has framed the events as part of a broader global pattern of domestic polarization in advanced democracies. For allies and competitors alike, the situation offers insights into the resilience of U.S. institutions under pressure. Looking ahead, the trajectory of the protests will depend on several factors. These include the actions taken by federal authorities, the willingness of political leaders to engage in dialogue, and the capacity of institutions to absorb public dissent without resorting to excessive force. At this stage, the protests represent a stress test rather than a systemic crisis. The United States has experienced periods of large-scale civil unrest before, and its institutions have generally endured. However, the long-term impact will be shaped by whether the underlying issues driving public mobilization are addressed or deferred. In conclusion, the nationwide protests are not solely about immigration enforcement. They reflect broader questions about governance, authority, and public trust in the United States. Their significance lies not only in their scale, but in what they reveal about the current state of American society and its role in an increasingly uncertain global environment. The end. Subscribe.